want to talk today about discrimination and minority stress, and probably more broadly the job that our field, that forensic psychology does in talking about those things, dealing with those things, working with those things. And mainly what I want to say is I don't think we do a good enough job doing those things. I think that it's imperative that this becomes more of a conversation in our field right now. I mean, I was going to say over the next 5 to 10 years, but no, like right now. And I don't just mean in our research. I mean, I think that that's coming slowly but surely, but I mean in our consultation rooms, our discussion boards, in every report that we write, in every interview that we do. I think that we need to do a better job, myself included, about asking about diversity, talking about diversity, finding a way to incorporate it into our opinions, our conceptualizations, our reports, in a way that's fair and balanced. Something that's frustrating about these social justice concerns is that in the past, I think a lot of the concerns around diversity have been seen as like not our lane. You know, we don't do that kind of psychology, or it isn't relevant to our opinions, or it introduces too much noise. And to be perfectly honest, I think that's just a way to avoid the issues. And it's a way that we as a field perpetuate harm, because not having the conversations is coming down on the wrong side of the issue. Not having the conversations, not working it into our formulations, not even acknowledging that we are a part of a system that systematically oppresses people of color, people with gender variance, people with disabilities. Socioeconomic status is in there. Language and culture is intricately wrapped in people's understandings of the legal system. And we have a really complicated and challenging role in navigating some of those dynamics, especially when unpacking some of the complicated history our own field has had and continues to have with contributing to some of these same systemic injustices. But then in the tension with our forensic specialty, wanting to distance ourselves some from the kinds of more active stance taking that the APA has been shifting towards. What I've been told from the point of entering this field through today is that we have a lane, and it's not a lane of advocacy. And I can understand that argument because, we're not advocates. We aren't clinicians in the clinical sense. We don't do therapy. And we don't have an allegiance to the client. We have an allegiance to the court. But really, again, if you unpack that, really it's that we have an allegiance to the truth. And the truth, well, first of all, there's many truths. It's in the eye of the beholder, or there's multiple truths, yours, mine, and reality, right? But let's just stick with data. The truth is in the data that these systems are contributing to injustice. And even so, I think these things can coexist. I think forensic psychology can coexist with social justice work and advocacy. Not as much specific person-based advocacy, but something that I've tried to call before objective advocacy. And I think the difference with that is that objective advocacy is the allegiance to justice, true justice. And we work in a flawed system where justice is a complicated concept. And we are not purveyors of justice. We are not the ones making decisions about justice, but it's naive to think that we have no influence on justice, which also means that we have accountability in the unjust. Disproportionate arrest rates are unjust, and our risk tools may compound them when we count prior arrests as a critical factor in our assessment. So that's just one example, but it's deluding ourselves if we don't acknowledge that our opinions participate in justice. and our reports participate in justice. And because of that, we are implicated in a system that we need to help change. We need to help change it to move toward a more objective place by teaching what we know about bias, about discrimination, from our research, but also from our work with people. And that starts with every single person who has to be a part of that, including me and you and us, especially because I think the courts have historically looked to us, to our field, to psychology, to set the lead on some of these social justice issues. And we haven't always risen to the call, but the precedent is there. The court is sometimes following us. They're often asking us those things that they have to make decisions about. Those broad social justice, bigger kinds of determinations, they're asking for our opinions about people. So I think that there's a way that we can demonstrate more humanity in the job that we do. And I mean that from the beginning to the end. In our interview, we need to be asking about diversity. We just have to be doing it every time. And we have to do it better. We don't always have to write about it in our report because it's going to come back to relevance. And we'll talk about relevance in a second. But we have to get better at having the conversation, or at least getting the pieces in place so that we can have the conversation if it's relevant. And we don't know if it's relevant if we don't ask. So we have to ask. We have to get better at asking. And I really suspect, and I don't know this to be a fact, but I strongly suspect that if we start to do this more routinely, then we're going to have to interrogate this very question of relevance right on its head, because that is such a culturally loaded idea right there, that the court gets to have this one narrow question, and we all participate in stripping down that question to a distilled and color-free notion, even though we all know from Psych 101 that the world doesn't work this way, that there's no way to separate a lifetime of fearing police officers from the obstruction charge for this individual who started screaming at police when they approached. It takes such audacity to say that race isn't relevant when we as white clinicians don't live that reality. But then we police each other with this word relevance as if those who dare to talk about race are committing a cardinal sin of answering a question that wasn't asked. But the court doesn't always know the question because they work with laws that regulate people, whereas in psychology, we take the position that people regulate laws. And those can be at odds sometimes because the power structure is clear. And we're at the bottom, right, as psychologists, in terms of the hierarchy of opinions and the way that information comes into the courtroom. Except sometimes that hierarchy, and I'm, of course, putting aside other hierarchies around power and oppression, just strictly talking about the hierarchy in the courtroom, that hierarchy sometimes compels us to collude with injustice. Not because anyone meant it to be that way, not because the court means it to be that way, or the parties, or us. But that collusion, we still have to recognize that. And it makes things difficult because that collusion is against our ethics. Different specialties, I think, handle this differently, and some have more wiggle room than I think we give ourselves in forensics. Because it's been my observation that here, we handle it with stoicism and silence. And so that's why I think we have to get better at talking about it and putting it into our reports, if only as a counterbalance to collusion. And I think that starts with also getting better about thinking about that interim step when we're conceptualizing a case or talking about it in a consultation group where we can push each other to think about how it might be relevant. And it's not clean and it's not clear. And that's a problem for some. But diversity is messy. It's person specific. We're not going to get a, you should do this every time, you should never do this kind of an answer. We're almost never going to get that around diversity. It's always going to be an individual kind of consideration and then overlaid with group data that's also quite imperfect. And that makes it especially difficult for us because we really do value objectivity, or what we call objectivity, and not being biased and having an adequate and sound basis for our opinions based in research and science. We value having those factors underlying our opinions, and those are for good reasons. Like, we should do that. And also, it can't be to the detriment of considering other identity variables. Because if we do that, then it tells a certain story anyway. Our refusal to participate in acknowledging the stories of people's lives and people's identities, it tells a different story anyway. And it's, at this point, decades and decades and decades of our participation in telling those stories, or probably more accurately, erasing those stories and not letting them be part of the forensic narrative, which we say is because of relevancy. And that, I think, has caused real harm. It's causing real harm to people because we get it wrong when we don't have a formulation that's culturally responsive. I don't know that there's an answer for this other than that we have to have more conversations about it, and we have to be more open to this topic. We have to be more willing to say, you know what, that makes me so uncomfortable to even think about that because it's such a departure from what I've been taught. It's such a departure from what I've been doing, and it makes me uncomfortable. And to just sit with that and then decide from that place, from an open place, is that discomfort helpful? Is it guiding? Is it something that is like, yeah, that's steering me away from my job and my role? Or is it that discomfort is protective of my own privilege, or that discomfort is protective of not complicating my job, because we're all busy and we all just want to get the job done in the best but also the most efficient way. And there's nothing wrong with that. And diversity complicates things, but it necessarily complicates them. And we can never lose sight of the fact that these are real people with real lives that we are affecting every single day. So we got to do better. We got to do better. This is Streamline Forensics, and we train forward.